One chilly autumn evening, I was driving home from visiting my friends in a nearby town. The sky was getting darker and a thick fog started to roll in, making the drive even more eerie. I was on a deserted stretch of highway when I saw a figure standing by the side of the road hitchhiking. It was a young man, maybe in his early 20s, with messy hair and a backpack slung over one shoulder. He looked cold and desperate, so I decided to pull over and help him. "Need a ride?" I asked, rolling down the window. "Yes, please," he replied, his voice trembling. "I need to get to the next town." I unlocked the door, and he climbed in, looking grateful. As we started driving, I tried to make conversation to ease the tension. "So, what's your name?" I asked. "Tom," he said quietly, staring out the window. "Where are you headed, Tom?" I continued. "Just passing through," he replied, avoiding eye contact. Something about him seemed off, but I couldn't put my finger on it. We drove in silence for a few miles until he suddenly pointed to a narrow dirt road leading into the woods. "Turn here," he said. I hesitated. "Are you sure? This doesn't look like a road to any town." "Please, it's a shortcut," he insisted, his voice almost pleading. Against my better judgment, I turned onto the dirt road. The further we drove, the denser the forest became. The trees seemed to close in on us, their branches forming a canopy overhead. The fog grew thicker, and the air became colder. After a few minutes, we reached a small clearing with an old, abandoned cabin in the center. Tom's demeanor changed. He looked anxious, glancing around nervously. "This is the place," he said, almost whispering. I stopped the car, and he got out, but before he closed the door, he turned to me. "Thank you for the ride. You should leave now." Something in his tone sent a shiver down my spine. I watched as he walked towards the cabin, disappearing into the fog. A sense of unease settled over me, and I decided to follow him, just to make sure he was safe. I approached the cabin slowly. The door was slightly ajar, and I could hear faint voices coming from inside. Pushing the door open, I stepped into the dimly lit room. The smell of damp wood and mold filled the air. In the corner, I saw Tom talking to an older man with a weathered face and piercing eyes. "You brought him here?" the man asked, his voice harsh and angry. "I had no choice," Tom replied, his voice shaking. "He wouldn't leave me alone." I realized they were talking about me. Panic set in, and I backed away, but I accidentally knocked over a chair, making a loud noise. Both men turned to look at me, their eyes filled with something I couldn't quite understand. Fear, anger, and something else. The older man stepped forward. "You shouldn't be here," he said ominously. "This is none of your business." "I'm sorry," I stammered. "I was just trying to help." "You've seen too much," he said, reaching into his pocket and pulling out a knife. "We can't let you leave." My heart pounded in my chest as I turned and bolted out the door. I ran through the foggy forest, branches scratching my face and tearing at my clothes. I could hear footsteps behind me, getting closer and closer. I reached my car and fumbled for my keys, finally getting the door open and jumping inside. I started the engine and sped down the dirt road, not daring to look back. The fog seemed to thicken, but I didn't slow down until I reached the main highway. Breathless and shaken, I drove straight to the nearest police station and reported what had happened. They sent a patrol car to investigate, but when they reached the cabin, it was empty. No sign of Tom, the older man, or any evidence of what I had witnessed. The police told me that the area had a history of strange occurrences, but they had never been able to prove anything. I left the station feeling a mix of relief and dread. Who were those men, and what were they hiding in that cabin? Since that night, I've been haunted by the memory of Tom and the mysterious cabin. I often wonder what would have happened if I hadn't followed him. I've avoided that stretch of highway ever since, but sometimes, when the fog rolls in, I can still hear the echo of their voices in the back of my mind. Before we get into the next story, if you come for the first time, please make sure to subscribe to a channel and press the bell icon for upcoming scary stories. We need your support. Please share the stories with your friends and family. Thanks. It was a cold, clear night when I was driving home from my parents' house. The road was empty, and the moon cast eerie shadows on the pavement. As I approached a lonely stretch of highway, I saw a figure standing by the side of the road, hitchhiking. He was a tall man wearing a tattered coat and a wide-brimmed hat that cast a shadow over his face. I hesitated for a moment, but decided to stop and offer him a ride. After all, it was freezing outside, and he looked like he needed help. "Need a lift?" I asked, rolling down the window. He nodded and climbed in without a word. As he settled into the seat, I noticed a strange smell, like old, wet earth. It was unsettling, but I tried to ignore it. "Where are you headed?" I asked, trying to break the silence. "Just a bit down the road," he said in a low, gravelly voice. As we drove, he remained silent, staring straight ahead. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off about him. His presence filled the car with a heavy, oppressive atmosphere. After a few miles, he pointed to a narrow dirt road that led into the woods. "Turn here," he instructed. I did as he said, even though my gut told me not to. The road was rough and overgrown, branches scraping against the car as we drove deeper into the forest. After a few minutes, we reached a clearing with an old, decrepit house at its center. "This is it," he said, finally breaking his silence. I stopped the car, and he got out. "Thanks for the ride," he said, his voice cold and devoid of emotion. As he walked towards the house, I couldn't help but feel a wave of relief that he was gone. I turned the car around and started to head back to the main road. But as I drove away, I glanced in the rearview mirror and saw him standing at the edge of the clearing, watching me. The unsettling encounter stayed with me, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I had narrowly escaped something terrible. When I got home, I told my wife about it. She listened, her face growing pale. "That sounds like the story of the hitchhiker's revenge," she said. I frowned. "What's that?" She explained that many years ago a man had been brutally murdered on that very road. His killer had never been caught, and legend had it that the man's spirit haunted the highway, seeking revenge on anyone who dared to pick him up. I laughed nervously, but the story stuck with me. Over the next few days, strange things started happening. I would hear footsteps outside my house at night, and my car's engine would start on its own. Once, I found muddy footprints leading from the front door to my bedroom window. Terrified, I decided to drive back to the clearing where I had dropped off the hitchhiker. Maybe if I went back, I could find some answers or even appease the restless spirit. When I arrived, the clearing was just as I remembered it, but the house looked even more dilapidated. I hesitated, then approached the front door. It creaked open on its own, and I stepped inside. The interior was dark and musty, filled with old furniture covered in dust and cobwebs. As I explored the house, I found a room with a single chair in the center. On the wall was a mirror, and in its reflection, I saw the hitchhiker standing behind me. I spun around, but there was no one there. The air grew cold, and I heard a whisper in my ear. "Why did you come back?" Panicking, I ran out of the house and back to my car. As I drove away, I felt a cold hand grip my shoulder. I screamed, swerving off the road and crashing into a tree. When I came to, I was lying in the hospital. My wife was beside me, her eyes filled with worry. "You're lucky to be alive," she said. "The police found you just in time." I knew then that the hitchhiker's spirit had followed me, seeking revenge. Since that night, I've never driven that road again, and I always warn others to stay away. But sometimes, late at night, I still feel that cold hand on my shoulder, reminding me that the hitchhiker's revenge is far from over. It was a dark and stormy night when I was driving home from visiting a friend in the next town. The rain was pouring down, and the road was nearly invisible in the gloom. As I navigated the winding road through the dense forest, I spotted a figure up ahead, drenched and waving for help. I slowed down and stopped beside the figure. It was a young man, soaked to the bone and shivering uncontrollably. "Do you need a ride?" I called out through the rolled-down window. "Please," he said, his voice trembling. "I need to get to the nearest town." I unlocked the door, and he got in, dripping water all over the seat. He looked terrified, his eyes darting around as if expecting something to leap out of the darkness. I tried to engage him in conversation, but he was mostly silent, staring out the window with a haunted look. After a few miles, he directed me to an old abandoned gas station on the outskirts of town. "This is my stop," he said quietly. I pulled over, and he got out, thanking me in a whisper. As he walked away, I noticed something strange. He wasn't casting a shadow under the station's flickering lights. Feeling uneasy, I drove to the town's diner and asked the waitress about the old gas station. Her face turned white. "That place has been abandoned for years," she said. "A young man was murdered there a long time ago. Some say his spirit still roams the road, looking for help." My blood ran cold as she told me the story. The young man had been hitchhiking when he was picked up by a stranger. They drove to the gas station, where the driver killed him and left his body to be discovered days later. Determined to find out more, I drove back to the gas station. The rain had stopped, but the air was thick with mist. I walked around the dilapidated building, but there was no sign of the young man. The place was eerily silent, the only sound being the drip of water from the roof. As I stood there, I felt a chill run down my spine. I had given a ride to a ghost, a restless spirit seeking help that would never come. Since that night, I've avoided that road, but sometimes when I hear the rain, I think about the haunted highway and the souls who wander it, forever lost in the storm. One rainy night, I was driving home from a late shift at work. The road was deserted, and the rain was coming down in sheets. As I rounded a bend, I saw a figure standing by the side of the road, drenched and shivering. It was a young woman, and she looked desperate for a ride. I pulled over and rolled down the window. "Do you need a lift?" I asked. She nodded, her eyes wide with fear. I unlocked the door and she climbed in, her clothes dripping wet. "Thank you," she said softly. "I need to get to the next town." As we drove, I tried to make small talk, but she seemed distant and anxious. She kept looking over her shoulder as if expecting someone to follow. I asked her name, but she just shook her head and stared out the window. After a few miles, she pointed to a small, run-down house on the outskirts of the next town. "This is my stop," she said. I pulled over and she got out, thanking me again. As she walked toward the house, I noticed something odd. She wasn't leaving any footprints in the muddy ground. Curious and a bit unnerved, I drove to the nearest gas station and asked the attendant about the house. His face went pale. "That house has been abandoned for years," he said. "No one's lived there since the accident." My heart raced as he explained that a young woman had died in a car accident nearby several years ago. She was said to haunt the road, looking for a ride home. I rushed back to the house, but the woman was gone. The door was locked and boarded up, and the house was dark and silent. I stood there in the rain, realizing I had given a ride to a ghost. Since that night, I've heard stories of the phantom hitchhiker, and I've always wondered if I had really helped her. Sometimes, when I drive that road, I look for her, hoping to see her again and maybe understand why she haunts that lonely stretch of highway.